Hello, I'm Raymond Shadow. Imagine this. Let me take you back to Prussia in the year 1820. It is a world shrouded in a double haze of coal soot and the Bible. Imagine yourself standing on the banks of the river Wupper. The water isn't clear, it's dyed a deep purple red, and the air is thick with the stinging scent of sulfur. Right there, in this suffocating industrial fog, a baby is born who is destined to detonate the old world with his ideas. He is like a spark stuffed into a suffocatingly conservative Puritan straitjacket. On the outside, a respectable bourgeois young master. On the inside, burning with a rebellious fire strong enough to start a prairie blaze. His life itself would become a brilliant experiment in dialectics, using money gained from exploitation to forge the sword that would bury the system of exploitation. This man was Friedrich Engels. The man history knows as Friedrich Engels was born on November 28, 1820, in the town of Barmen, on the Wupper. We have to stop and really examine this location because it determined the undertone of Engels' entire life. At the time, the town belonged to the Rhine province of the Kingdom of Prussia in Western Germany. It was the outpost of the German Industrial Revolution and the place where contradictions were sharpest. Later, in the 20th century, this key town was merged into the city of Wuppertal. But back then, Barmen wasn't just a production hub for textiles, it was a stronghold of extreme religious conservatism. The air seemed to hold only two things: coal smoke thick enough to turn crows black, and a suffocating religious piety. Engels was born into a prosperous merchant family in the textile industry. These weren't petty traders, they were a local dynasty. His father, also named Friedrich Engels, Engels Sr., was the grandson of Johann Caspar Engels I. This grandfather was a true self-made entrepreneur who, decades earlier, had established a successful linen bleaching enterprise under the name Caspar Engels Zuna. In those days, this kind of family legacy implied an unshakable authority and responsibility. Old Friedrich Engels, born in 1796, was practically a textbook example of Prussian capitalism. He worked in the family business his whole life, diligent, rigid, and cold. After his father, Johann Caspar Engels II, died in 1821, the family didn't see peace. Instead, a conflict over interests erupted. He and his brothers got involved in a long dispute over inheritance rights. This was likely young Engels' earliest visual lesson on how private property leads to alienation. It wasn't until 1837 that this family civil war ended. Old Friedrich partnered with the Erman brothers from Holland to establish cotton spinning mills in Manchester, Barmen, and nearby Engelskirchen. This move was crucial because it not only expanded the family empire but paved the way for Engels to go to England later and touch the very heart of industrial capitalism. Although old Friedrich was known for his cold profit-seeking, shrewd business mind, and strict religious puritanism, he wasn't a flat, cartoonish villain. The complexity of human nature was fully evident in him. He was also an amateur musician who played multiple instruments and loved hosting family concerts. You can picture this scene. This stern father, who had just berated a worker in the factory over a few pfennigs in wages, comes home and plays the cello with deep emotion. This split personality, perhaps, was inherited by his son. In 1819, old Friedrich married Elizabeth van Haar, known to the family as Eliza. If the father represented the cold laws of reality, the mother was the only window of warmth in that house. She came from a family of clergy and scholars in nearby Ham, and humanist blood flowed in her veins. The couple had 8 children, 4 boys and 4 girls, with young Friedrich being the eldest. As the firstborn, from the moment he arrived, he was burdened with the high expectation of inheriting the family business, a privilege, but also a shackle. Thanks to her family's intellectual background, Eliza encouraged her son's interest in literature and classical mythology. She would secretly slip young Engels Greek epics, telling him legends of heroes full of rebellious spirit. This spiritual food planted the seeds of romanticism in young Engels' heart. Although Friedrich would later completely cut ties with his namesake father over politics and faith, he maintained a close relationship with his mother all his life. Even in his later years, when Engels mentioned his mother, his eyes would show a rare tenderness. Friedrich Engels was born into the era of European political and industrial revolutions, a chaotic time when the old order was collapsing, and the new one had not yet been established. Let's widen the lens. The French Revolution of 1789 was decades past, but it had witnessed the adoption of radical liberal doctrines, the universal rights of man. This wave of thought wandered the European continent like a spectre, even though it had quickly descended into bloodshed and terror in the early 1790s, terrifying many conservatives. Subsequently, Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in 1799. As first consul and later emperor of the French, he restored a kind of stability to France. Although Napoleon was an emperor, the army that swept across Europe carried the code Napoleon in its knapsacks, a heavy hammer to smash feudal hierarchy. Although Napoleon's effort to establish a pan-European French empire failed in 1815, the smoke of Waterloo cleared, and the Bourbons were restored. One of the factors leading to his defeat was Britain's economic dominance. This point is crucial for Engels' later understanding that the economic base determines the superstructure. The Royal Navy controlled global maritime trade, and its economy had pioneered industrialization in the latter half of the 18th century. While the continent was fighting over royal successions, the British were reshaping the world with steam engines. France's defeat and Britain's growing prosperity highlighted the immense benefits of industrialization. The explosive wealth growth brought by machine production made everyone envious. Soon, the continental powers began seeking to emulate the British example. And Engels' hometown was the vanguard of this imitation game. The Engels family were industrial pioneers in the Rhineland, a region that would become Germany's industrial heart in the 19th century. As early as 1775, Friedrich's great-grandfather had foresightedly introduced mechanical lace manufacturing to the area. By the time young Friedrich was born, his hometown of Barmen had a population of about 16,000, which wasn't small for the time. But the scary part was its growth rate. 20 years later, that number swelled to 40,000, earning the town the nickname the German Manchester. However, all this industrialization brought problems, chiefly manifesting as a growing urban working class sinking into poverty. This wasn't a pastoral kind of lack, but a hellish destitution. Workers faced brutally strict hours, sometimes working 60 to 70 hours a week. Can you imagine? In workshops filled with cotton dust, tuberculosis was standard, and rickets was the norm. It is worth mentioning that the Engels family factory was one of the few in the area that did not hire child labor, and the family was dedicated to charitable initiatives supporting the impoverished members of society. Perhaps this was a small effort by old Engels to balance his pietist conscience, but in the cruel environment of the time, it was merely a drop in the bucket. Young Engels watched all of this growing up. He saw his father handing out bread with one hand while calculating pennies in the ledger with the other. The impact of this hypocrisy was stronger than any book. There is little information about young Friedrich's childhood. He and his siblings were mostly with their mother because old Friedrich was busy managing business interests. The father was always absent, or else appeared with the whip of authority. In 1828, Friedrich began attending the local primary school in Barmen. German education at the time was rigorous but extremely rigid. Although he later criticized the teachers as conservative and unimaginative, he once mocked them as parrots who could only recite dogma. He enjoyed chemistry and physics classes, which sparked a lifelong interest in science. This love for natural science later became the foundation for his dialectical materialist view of nature. At age 14, in 1834, he was sent to board at the Gymnasium, grammar school, in Elberfeld. This was an elite school, and he lived in the home of the headmaster, Dr. Henschke. Engels claimed this school was considered one of the best in Prussia, and that wasn't an exaggeration. Here, he received a liberal arts education including various sciences, several ancient and modern languages, as well as history and religion. It was in this high school that Engels revealed an astonishing talent for languages. Friedrich excelled in linguistics. Latin and Greek were a piece of cake for him. This laid the groundwork for his later ability to read materials in dozens of languages and guide revolutionary movements across countries. More importantly, he was exposed to the ideas of 18th-century Enlightenment philosophers, who advocated replacing religious superstition with human reason. Voltaire's mockery and Rousseau's passion began to ferment in this teenager's mind. Furthermore, Engels took an interest in German folklore and history, inspiring a romantic patriotism influenced by Johann Gottfried von Herder and Johann Gottlieb Fichte. Germany at the time was a fragmented puzzle, with countless small states governing themselves. Although the conservative Prussian monarchy had gained the Rhineland after the Napoleonic Wars, the liberal German patriotic movement remained influential until 1819. There was a suppressed anger in that era. The Austrian Empire's powerful chancellor, Prince Clemens von Metternich, that reactionary ringleader known as the Coachman of Europe, had passed the Carlsbad decrees, banning liberal student societies and restricting press freedom. These Austrian measures were quickly adopted across the German Confederation, including the Kingdom of Prussia. Inside this pressure cooker, Engels' rebellious character began to take shape. In Elberfeld, the teenage Engels didn't turn into a bookworm who only studied. He wrote poetry and prose praising liberal traditions, views that were at odds with his father. He mocked the bureaucrats in wigs spouting moral platitudes and yearned for the heroism of ancient Teutonic knights. These early literary attempts, though immature, were full of drive. In 1837, with just 1 year left until graduation, fate played a joke on him. Or rather, his father didn't want to tolerate this good-for-nothing son any longer. Engels was withdrawn from school against his will. Old Engels' logic was simple: can writing poetry put food on the table? Can philosophy make the factory run? No. So, Friedrich was not permitted to pursue his hobbies but was forcibly inducted into the textile industry. This was a huge blow to young Engels, but also a turning point. In 1838, father and son traveled to England to inspect the Raymond Engels operations in Manchester. This was his first time setting foot on British soil. Although it was a brief stay, he saw the true face of that industrial monster. On the return journey, they stopped in the historic port city of Bremen. His father made a decision to leave young Friedrich there, apprenticing him to the linen merchant Henrik Leupold. Old Engels hoped the tedious accounts would smooth out his son's edges, but he miscalculated. As a clerk in the trading house, Engels did learn to handle international transactions, gaining an understanding of global capitalism through exchange rates, import duties, and profit margins. This commercial knowledge was something the later Marx sorely lacked. You could say that it was this reluctant apprenticeship that allowed him to master the enemy's cipher. But outside of work, Engels lived a distinctly double life. He fell under the influence of the Young Germany radical political movement there. This was a left-wing nationalist group led by writers like Heine, who rejected romantic nostalgia for medieval Germany in favor of a future-oriented, democratic Germany characterized by religious freedom and the abolition of aristocratic privileges. In 1839, Engels published his first work, a poem titled The Bedouin. In it, he lamented that this once proud Arab people had been reduced to performing in Parisian circuses. The poem was full of metaphors. He was hinting that the Germans were like those lions in cages, having lost their freedom and dignity. Beyond poetry, Engels wrote articles for the Telegraph für Deutschland under the pseudonym Friedrich Oswald. Why a pseudonym? To avoid linking the respected Engels family name with his increasingly radical political views, and to protect himself. These views were woven into literary critiques and travelogues to evade censorship. In his articles, he didn't just talk about literature, he began attacking current politics. The most famous piece was Letters from Wuppertal, published in 1839. This wasn't just an article, it was a bomb thrown at his hometown. In the 1830s, as the textile industry in Barmen began to suffer from competition, from Britain, Belgium, France, Austria, and other new production areas, profits fell and working conditions worsened. In his letters, Engels ruthlessly exposed the demoralized, exploited, and often excessively drunken state of the working people. He wrote, "Here, if you do not die of hunger, you can die of alcohol." Many used increasing amounts of alcohol to numb the physical aches and psychological pain of long hours in factories and mines. What shocked Barmen's high society even more was that, while attacking the employers of Wuppertal, Engels highlighted their hypocrisy. They loved to preach their so-called religious piety to the wider community while being the worst exploiters of the poorest classes in those same communities. He specifically called out that pietism, a direct slap in his father's face. These sentiments reflected Engels' rejection of the dogmatic Protestantism he inherited from his father, after encountering David Friedrich Strauss's The Life of Jesus. This book was banned at the time because it treated the Bible not as the Word of God, but as a product of its historical context. Strauss reduced Jesus to a historical figure, stripping away the divine halo. After reading this, Engels completely broke with the Christian faith. He went from a theist to a pantheist, and finally, to an atheist. Filling the vacuum of faith was philosophy. Engels soon embraced the philosophy of G.W.F. Hegel. Hegel was a German philosopher who had died recently in 1831, with some works only published posthumously in the 1830s and 40s. Hegel's philosophy was massive and obscure, but one core idea deeply attracted Engels: historical progress is driven by spirit or self-conscious human reason. Although Hegel didn't completely reject the idea of God, he believed God and humanity were on a shared path to freedom and progress, rejecting blind obedience to God. In 1841, his apprenticeship ended. To escape that suffocating home in Barmen and to see the outside world, Engels made a decision: he joined the army. As part of his one-year compulsory service in the Prussian Guard artillery, Engels settled in Berlin. This was no ordinary military service. Engels put on the blue Prussian artillery uniform, but he was more like a philosopher undercover in the barracks. Besides attending military drills, incidentally, he was an excellent gunner, which laid the foundation for later being called the General. Engels used his free time to attend lectures at the city's university, today's Humboldt University. Berlin University was the battleground of German thought at the time. Hegel had held the chair of philosophy there from 1818 until his death in 1831. Although Hegel emphasized the state as one of the primary drivers of historical development, a view accepted by Prussian conservatives to justify the legitimacy of the Prussian state, Hegel's more radical disciples, the young Hegelians, utilized the revolutionary side of Hegel's dialectics. What is dialectics? Simply put, it's the concept of deploying an opposing thesis, and antithesis, to argue before reaching a synthesis of the two. According to this, every historical era is defined by a prevailing social and political orthodoxy, which is then challenged, eventually leading to a political synthesis. For example, the French Revolution began with the orthodoxy of the ancien régime and absolute monarchy, thesis, which was then challenged by the radical liberalism of the 1789 French Revolution fighting the system, antithesis, finally resulting in a synthesis of the two systems in the early 19th century, synthesis. Inspired by this approach to political development, the young Hegelians posed a liberal challenge to Prussian conservatism. They argued that the Prussian state was also just a stage in history, destined to be negated. Engels spent many nights in Berlin's beer halls, joining the famous Doctors' Club. He discussed philosophical problems with a group of like-minded scholars and journalists gathered around Hegel's former student, the philosopher Bruno Bauer. Here, he not only honed his debating skills but also wrote a series of pamphlets attacking the official philosopher of the time, Schelling, such as Schelling and Revelation. He used Hegel's logic to lambaste Schelling's mysticism, gaining fame in Berlin's intellectual circles. Everyone was asking, who is that brilliant Oswald? No one guessed he was just an artilleryman doing his service. In October 1842, Engels' 1 year of national service ended, and he had to return to Barmen. This time in Berlin not only armed him theoretically but convinced him, change in Germany was imminent. But old Friedrich Engels was frustrated, even terrified, by his son's growing radicalism. He decided to send this dangerous son far away, to a place with only business and no philosophy. So, he decided to send him to Manchester to work as a general assistant at the Erman Engels textile mill. The father hoped the thick commercial atmosphere of England would cure his son's philosophy sickness, and turn him into a true capitalist. Little did he know, he was releasing a tiger back into the wild. In November 1842, on his way to England, Engels visited the offices of the Rheinische Zeitung in Cologne. This was a newly founded, liberal-leaning newspaper. And there, he met its new editor-in-chief for the first time, Karl Marx. It was a historic meeting, but not love at first sight as many imagine. Marx was 24 at the time, already a formidable-looking PhD. Born in 1818 in Trier, Western Germany, to a Jewish family that had recently converted to Lutheranism, Marx first studied law at the University of Bonn, then transferred to Berlin to study philosophy, joining the young Hegel movement there. Because his anti-religious thesis was too controversial for conservative Berlin, Marx left the Prussian capital in 1841, a few months before Engels arrived, and obtained his doctorate from the University of Jena. In 1842, he began writing for the newly established Rheinische Zeitung and, upon becoming editor, immediately revived the struggling paper's fortunes. Engels had also previously contributed to the Rheinische Zeitung. But this meeting was very cold. Marx was trying to turn the paper into a serious political publication and was very repulsed by the Free Group in Berlin, those empty talkers who were a bit sensationalist, and he mistakenly thought Engels was one of them. Engels was stung by Marx's indifference, but he didn't stay long, continuing on to England. What he didn't know was that the upcoming trip to England would transform him from a radical Democrat into a communist, and eventually qualify him to be Marx's indispensable comrade in arms. Their political, philosophical, and social views would gradually align over the next few years, especially as both Marx and Engels soon began to disagree with certain orthodoxies in Hegel's thought. Within a few years, they would form one of the most important intellectual partnerships of the 19th century. But before that, Engels had to face the industrial monster alone. When Engels arrived there in December 1842, Manchester was a city of over 300,000 people, the heart of the British textile industry, and the most terrifying yet fascinating place on earth at that time. It was known as Cottonopolis. The French political scientist Alexis de Tocqueville, who had just published his landmark 2-volume study Democracy in America, visited the place and described Manchester as a new Hades covered in black smoke spewing from forests of chimneys. This was no exaggeration. Here, the sky was always grey, and the River Irwell flowed not with water, but with black slime mixed with dye, excrement, and industrial waste. People could not escape the noise of creaking machine wheels or furnaces. This low-frequency roar beat like a heart, day and night. Despite having visited the city briefly before, Engels was shocked by the level of poverty and destitution he encountered. Unlike the small-scale industry in his hometown of Barmen, which still retained a little warmth, this was a thorough, naked, monstrous industrial capitalism. Just months prior, Manchester had experienced the plug plot riots. In August 1842, after political authorities in London rejected working-class demands for male suffrage and labor reform, a series of strikes erupted across the country. Workers pulled the plugs from steam boilers, paralyzing factories. Although the army quickly suppressed the riots, the undercurrent of anger still surged beneath the city. Engels worked at the Victoria Mill in Salford, just across the River Irwell from Manchester. He began his famous double life. By day, he was Mr. Engels, dressed respectably, chatting and laughing at the exchange. He had to display the shrewd business acumen his father hoped for. But deep inside, he was like a spy deep in the enemy's heart, coldly observing the secrets of how it all operated. He didn't lock himself in the office. After work, he attended meetings at the Hall of Science held by Owenites. This institution was established by followers of the agrarian socialist Robert Owen, who inspired the establishment of cooperatives across the country. Although the Owenite idea of establishing model communities seemed a bit naive to Engels, he saw the organizational potential of the working class here. Engels also established contact with the Chartist movement. This was a group lobbying for male suffrage in annual elections, the largest working-class political movement in the world at the time. While Engels sympathized with the working-class Chartist movement, he didn't believe reforms within the existing social and political system were enough to liberate the British working class. He pondered, if they merely gained the right to vote while the means of production remained in the hands of capitalists, would the workers' fate really change? In his critique of industrial capitalism, Engels was influenced by the works of Thomas Carlyle. Carlyle was a radical social critic who argued that the lives of factory workers were worse than those of medieval serfs. At least serfs had the protection of lords and attachment to the land, while modern workers were free to have nothing, ready to be discarded at any moment. At this critical moment, a woman walked into his life, or more accurately, led him into another world. Mary Burns was one of Engels' guides to the working-class districts of Manchester. She was a young Irish woman in her early 20s, with red hair and that resilient look in her eyes found only in those struggling at the bottom. She was likely a domestic servant or factory worker when she met Engels in early 1843. Imagine the scene. One is a German rich kid trained in Hegelian philosophy, the other an illiterate Irish female worker who has tasted the bitterness of life. These should have been people from two parallel worlds, yet they generated a chemical reaction that transcended class and time. The two soon became romantic partners and would live together for the next 20 years. A point must be emphasized here, they never married. In Victorian England, this was absolutely scandalous. But the choice itself was a political statement. Both viewed marriage as an oppressive bourgeois institution, a contract based on property and subordination. They chose a union based on free will, which was more powerful than any essay on women's liberation at the time. Mary introduced Engels to the Manchester Irish immigrant communities living in the city's poorest areas, places a man of Engels' upper-class background would rarely set foot in during the 19th century. That was the slum known as Little Ireland, where even the police dared not enter alone. Here, Mary provided Engels with valuable insights into the condition of the working class, influencing his thinking. He was no longer an observer from high above. He saw families of 8 huddled in damp cellars, saw children swilling cheap gin to forget their hunger. These weren't statistics, these were living, breathing people. Recognizing that German socialist and communist ideas were too theoretical, in 1843, Engels wrote an article titled Outlines of a Critique of Political Economy for Marx's new publication, the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbuch. This article, short by modern standards, was like a lightning bolt at the time. In it, he conducted an empirical analysis of British capitalist political economy, puncturing the myth of the perfect market constructed by Adam Smith and David Ricardo. He pointed out sharply, private property leads to the alienation of man from his natural essence and turns man into a slave of material commodities. Competition is not a regulator of freedom, but a war of the weak against the strong, inevitably leading to monopoly. This article made Marx's blood boil in Paris. He later called it a brilliant sketch. For Engels, the abolition of private property would bring about communism. This was a political idea emerging in the 1840s, advocating the establishment of a new utopian society where industrial enterprises would be taken over by worker collectives or communes. In this way, ordinary workers would transform from oppressed individuals exploited by bourgeois capitalists into people mastering their own destiny. Engels developed these ideas into a series of articles, subsequently compiled into one of his most famous books, The Condition of the Working Class in England, published in German in 1845. This book wasn't an academic work concocted in a study. Every page dripped with Manchester's rain and soot. Engels cited not only his first-hand experience of Manchester's slums but also government records and articles from liberal bourgeois newspapers. He turned the bourgeoisie's own reports into evidence against them. He declared, "I charge the English middle class with mass murder, wholesale robbery, and all the other crimes in the calendar." This accusation was explosive at the time. The murder he defined wasn't killing someone with a knife, but social murder, when you place a person in an environment that inevitably leads to their early death, that is not only murder but a more despicable, hidden form of murder. While describing Britain, he was also warning the German bourgeoisie, because he believed the social crisis he witnessed in Britain would soon spread to the continent. Despite having Mary Burns as a guide, Engels couldn't avoid stereotypes about the Irish, calling them carefree, happy, potato-eating children of nature, completely unsuited for drudgery in Manchester factories, whose only reaction to their miserable existence was to drown their sorrows in drink. This description carried the limitations of the era but also reflected his pain at how industrialization destroyed traditional ways of life. Engels observed that the terrible conditions endured by the Irish also dragged down the wages of other workers, leading to widespread poverty. This actually revealed the early form of capital using immigrant labor to divide the working class. Engels described the constant surveillance of factory workers by managers and the practice of setting clocks a quarter-hour fast so workers would lose hours of wages. He concluded that the existence of the British working class was worse than that of African slaves in North America, because slave owners at least had to keep their slaves alive, whereas capitalists could discard this batch of workers at any time and get a new one. In later parts of his work, Engels observed that the industrial city of Manchester was built specifically to segregate the urban proletariat of poor workers from the capitalist bourgeoisie. This was starkly different from his hometown of Barmen, where owners and workers lived close together. Although Manchester had beautiful shops and warehouses in the city and served as a place for commercial transactions, it was surrounded by high-density working-class districts crisscrossed by a labyrinth of alleys. Wealthier residents lived further out in communities with regular street patterns, while the richest lived in villas in the surrounding countryside, far from the filthy air. Most ingeniously, the wealthy areas were connected to the city center by straight roads lined with respectable shops, so they could travel to the business district without ever having to witness the destitution of the working-class slums. This wasn't just urban planning, it was a psychological defense mechanism. Engels was not only a sociologist but one of the earliest urban geographers, revealing how space was used to solidify class. However, Engels believed that the elaborate urban zoning the bourgeoisie undertook to isolate themselves from the working class also created conditions for workers to unite and generate class consciousness. When you pack tens of thousands of people like sardines into the same slum, you also create a massive powder keg. This offered the possibility of a class-conscious proletariat rising up quickly in response to appalling conditions. Engels viewed the conflict between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie as the next stage of historical development, which would lead to the destruction of big industrial cities, replaced by the integration of town and country. The condition of the working class in England was primarily written and compiled in Germany, as Engels left Manchester in the summer of 1844 to return to Barmen. On his return journey, the gears of history clicked into place. He met Karl Marx in Paris on August 28. Since their last frosty meeting in Cologne, Marx had moved to Paris after the Rhenish Zeitung was shut down by Prussian authorities following complaints from Tsar Nicholas I about the paper's comments on the Polish nationalist cause, much of Poland having been annexed by Prussia and Russia. This time, there was no coldness, only sparks. Marx was deeply impressed by Engels' writings on the capitalist economy, especially that outline. The two sat in the Café de la Régence in Paris for 10 days straight. 10 days of red wine, cigars, and intense intellectual collision. They now became close ideological allies. The result of this second meeting was that they became lifelong friends and collaborators, starting a famous partnership that would last for the next 40 years. These two men had walked independent paths to reach the same ideological destination. In their long collaboration, Engels was happy to let Marx take the lead in establishing the ideological foundations of their philosophy, although he played a significant role in constructing Marx's thoughts. Engels actually brought what Marx lacked most, a perceptual knowledge of industrial reality and empirical analysis of economic data. Without Engels, Marx might have remained merely a Hegelian philosopher in a study. Their first collaboration was a short attack on Bruno Bauer and the young Hegelians, titled The Holy Family, dripping with sarcasm. The title mocked Bauer's circle for thinking of themselves as holy saviors. The book condemned their obsession with metaphysical Hegelian spirit while failing to acknowledge the role of material wealth and property in determining social structures. It was a formal declaration of war on their old circle of friends. During the journey from Paris to Barmen, Engels was pleased to see the spread of socialist and communist sentiments in the Rhineland. In early 1845, he and the German Jewish philosopher and social critic Moses Hess organized a series of meetings on communism for the local bourgeoisie. It was essentially asking a tiger for its hide, but young Engels was full of confidence. Building on themes first raised in his outlines, Engels argued that capitalist competition would ultimately result in a society consisting of a few extremely wealthy individuals and a mass of destitute workers, with no class in between, thus building up pressure for a fairer distribution of wealth. Engels argued that a communist system would be more productive, eliminating resources wasted competing for the same goals, and instead allocating resources effectively based on need. Meanwhile, technological innovation could be harnessed for the public good. Engels assured his conservative audience that communism would not be achieved through violent revolution, but through paternalistic persuasion. At this point, Engels was still trying to use reason to persuade capitalists. He won a few converts at each meeting, but his activities attracted the attention of the authorities, which embarrassed his father greatly, who cut off his allowance. This strained relationship between Friedrich and the rest of his family would persist throughout almost his entire adult life. Meanwhile, Marx faced complaints again for his activities in the French capital and was forced to leave Paris for Brussels in the spring of 1845. Engels joined him in the Belgian capital. The two friends took a short trip to England to visit urban slums and study economic data at Chetham's Library in Manchester. It was in that famous window seat at Chetham's Library, with the two of them hunched over mountains of blue books, that the course of world history began to be rewritten. Engels reconnected with Mary Burns, and when they returned to Belgium in late summer, Mary joined them. In Brussels, Marx and Engels lived in adjacent apartments with their respective partners. It was a wonderful communal life. The two began working on their next collaboration, titled The German Ideology. Although this book was never published in their lifetime, as Marx later joked, we abandoned the manuscript to the gnawing criticism of the mice. It was a crucial step in the development of their theory of historical materialism. This doctrine held that historical change is determined by the transition from one mode of social organization to another, dictated by economic and technical factors, rather than by the actions of nation-states and their rulers, as was the traditional view of historical causation at the time. Simply put, Napoleon didn't create history, history created Napoleon. Marx and Engels observed that every stage of social transformation is fiercely resisted by the ruling elite, and only revolution can bring about a new form of social organization. This revolution need not necessarily be violent. Marx and Engels believed that establishing democracy through universal suffrage would eventually bring about communism in a relatively peaceful manner. Consistent with this view, in 1846, Marx and Engels established the Communist Correspondence Committee to coordinate the activities of European socialists. This was effectively the prototype of the first international workers' political party. From the start, it carried a dogmatic tinge, with Marx and Engels attempting to impose ideological unity on the committee's members. In this spirit, Engels traveled to Paris in August 1846 to take on the supporters of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. The French philosopher's 1840 treatise What is Property? Had influenced Marx and Engels, convincing them that the concept of private property itself was the root of many problems in industrial society. However, Proudhon's prescription for socialist cooperation was deemed too idealistic, so-called petty bourgeois socialism. At workers' gatherings in Paris, Engels, with his fluent French and sharp logic, stripped away Proudhon's influence bit by bit. In June 1847, Engels attended the Congress of the League of the Just in London as a delegate from Paris. During the meeting, the organization was renamed the Communist League. This name change was significant because justice is a vague moral concept, while communism is a clear political goal. They adopted the slogan "Workers of the World, Unite," replacing the original, "After all men are brothers." Engels was assigned to draft a statement of the League's goals, initially adopting a QA format titled Draft of a Communist Confession of Faith. In it, he declared that the aim of communism was to organize society in such a way that every member of it can develop and use all his capabilities and powers in complete freedom and without thereby infringing the basic conditions of this society. Although the text contained many of Marx and Engels' ideas about the proletariat as the vanguard of socialist revolution, Engels was forced to compromise with utopian socialists. He drafted a second version, Principles of Communism, in October. The principles were prepared for the Second Congress held in London starting late November. This time, Marx attended the meeting, and he and Engels ensured the principles were unanimously adopted. The two were then asked to write a manifesto based on these principles. First in London, and later in Brussels, Marx and Engels worked on writing what became the Communist Manifesto, one of the most influential political theory works in history. The manifesto owed much to Engels' observations of the British proletariat in Manchester, forming the basis for the description of the global proletariat, described as a class of laborers, who live only so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. Marx and Engels cast off their Hegelian baggage, declaring that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, ultimately leading to proletarian revolution. Nevertheless, Marx's literary style stood out in his description of the rapid industrial and social developments brought by the bourgeoisie, claiming the bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. The consequence is that all that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life, and his relations with his kind. This passage is practically a herald of modernism. It describes not just the economy, but the mental state of modern people. The text went on to expound on how a communist society should be established. Although the text of the Communist Manifesto was the result of extensive intellectual exchange between Marx and Engels dating back to 1843, the treatise was primarily written by Marx, not Engels, even though both names appeared on the cover when it was published in London in late February 1848. Despite its later immense influence, the Communist Manifesto had almost no impact on wider society when first published. It was like a letter sent to the future, lying temporarily in the mailbox. Instead, Marx and Engels were overtaken by revolutions occurring in the streets of Paris and many other European capitals. On February 24, 1848, the increasingly authoritarian King Louis-Philippe I was overthrown, replaced by the French Second Republic. The bourgeois democratic revolution predicted by Marx and Engels seemed to be underway, and the two were eager to play their part. To escape attempts by European monarchies to arrest them as part of a broader reactionary crackdown on political dissidents, they left Brussels and arrived in Paris in early March. At that moment, the air smelled of gunpowder and freedom. Engels looked at the red flags on the streets of Paris and felt the theories in his books had finally become reality. But he didn't expect this was just the prelude to the storm. The crueler tests were yet to come. Events in Paris inspired demonstrations in Vienna, leading to the resignation in March of Metternich, the reactionary godfather who had ruled Europe for decades, and also sparking nationalist uprisings in northern Italy against Austrian rule. By mid-March, the revolution spread to Prussia, where King Friedrich Wilhelm IV was forced to make liberal concessions to keep his throne. It all happened so fast, it was dizzying. Marx and Engels decided to set up base in Cologne. Why Cologne? Because it was the center of the Rhineland, the place where industry was most developed and the proletarian force was strongest. There, Marx revived his old newspaper, renaming it the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. This paper wasn't for reporting news, it was for manufacturing it. It called for a united front of workers and bourgeois elements against feudal despotism. Engels was the soul of the newspaper. While Marx was the editor-in-chief holding the general direction, Engels' spicy, sharp, combative writing style made the new Rheinische Zeitung a revolutionary machine gun. He worked more than 10 hours a day, processing war reports flying in from all over Europe, using his pen to pierce every liberal parliamentarian who tried to compromise. However, revolution costs money. Engels was sent to Barmen to raise funds from relatives, but returned empty-handed. You can imagine the scene. This red, viewed as the black sheep of the family, returns to that mansion filled with the scent of pietism, trying to convince his wealthy uncles to cough up money to fund a revolution designed to wipe them out. The result was predictable. Not only did he get no money, but he was also nearly kicked out by his father again. The honeymoon period of the 1848 revolution didn't last long. This is the cruel dialectic of history. While radicals bled in the streets, the liberal bourgeoisie trembled in parliament. They feared the proletariat more than they feared the king. By summer, conservatives and reactionary forces regained the initiative, buying off the liberal bourgeoisie with some concessions. In Germany and Austria, the ruling class isolated the radicals and used military force to re-establish authority. By September 1848, Cologne was effectively under martial law. Engels was forced to flee and return to Paris, from where he began a long journey to Basel, Switzerland. This journey was fraught with danger. He had to dodge Prussian arrest warrants and endure the embarrassment of being penniless. He recorded the vineyards and beautiful scenery he saw along the way in his diary. Even on the run, he maintained that optimistic poet sentiment. But he didn't stay idle. He was very interested in the situation in Hungary, where nationalist leader Lajos Kossuth controlled the parliament in Budapest and established a government independent of the Austrian Empire. Kossuth was a charismatic orator, but his Hungarian nationalism was opposed by Slavic minorities, who allied with the Austrian army to defeat the Hungarians. And the Vienna government also allied with the Russian Empire. Tsarist Russia, known as the gendarme of Europe, sent troops to suppress nationalist movements in Eastern and Central Europe. Inspired by Kossuth, Engels resolved to return to Germany to wage guerrilla war against the Prussian authorities. He wasn't the kind of intellectual who only talked revolution in cafes. He truly wanted to smell the gunpowder. So, in January 1849, risking his life, he returned to Cologne. In March, the situation intensified again. The Frankfurt National Assembly passed a liberal imperial constitution unifying Germany and invited Prussian King Friedrich Wilhelm IV to be emperor. This was a plan full of compromise, but these naive professor parliamentarians thought the king would be grateful. As a result, the Prussian king refused to accept the crown from the gutter, as he called it, from a people's assembly, triggering more uprisings against Prussian authority. In May 1849, workers in Engels' hometown of Elberfeld formed a revolutionary militia. This was the famous Imperial Constitution campaign. Engels immediately rushed back to his hometown. He was appointed to organize the town's defense. The moment was deeply ironic. Just a few years ago, he was kicked out of school here. Now, standing on barricades made of cotton bales produced by his own family's factory, he was commanding workers to check their rifles. But he soon discovered how unreliable petty bourgeois revolutionaries were. Engels' move to replace the German black-red-gold tricolor with the communist red flag terrified his compatriots. Those city councillors only wanted to scare the king, not actually implement communism. As the Prussian army crushed the rebels, Engels was soon ordered to leave. He was expelled by the very people he was trying to defend. But this didn't extinguish his fighting spirit. Engels went south, joining the troops of rebel leader August Willich in Baden, southwestern Germany. Willich was a former Prussian officer turned communist. Engels became his aide-de-camp. Here, Engels truly earned the nickname that would stay with him for life, the General. He participated in 4 major battles, including the desperate resistance at Rastatt. On the battlefield, he was exceptionally calm. While bullets whistled past his ears, he was observing the terrain, calculating trajectories. He discovered this wasn't just about courage, it was a science. It was a heroic but desperate effort to stop the last revolutionary resistance forces from being wiped out by the Prussian army. In the aftermath of the failed revolution, Engels retreated with the remnants to Switzerland. He crossed the border at the last moment, with the sound of Prussian cavalry hooves behind him. In a Swiss tavern, he wrote an account of his experiences in the campaign for the German Imperial Constitution. It wasn't just a battle report, it was an indictment full of anger. He blasted the petty bourgeoisie for abandoning the workers, accusing them of weakness and betrayal at the critical moment. The experiences of 1848 prompted Marx and Engels to rethink their strategy. After closing the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, Marx had briefly moved to Paris, but the increasingly authoritarian French government under Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the future Emperor Napoleon III, forced him into exile in London. Engels soon joined him there, and the pair would be based in England for the next few decades. In the aftermath of 1848, the German revolutionaries exiled in London fell into mutual blame over the failure of the revolution. It was a time full of bitterness, hunger, and suspicion. Britain at the time harbored revolutionary exiles from across the continent. As always, as ideologies developed, the two left old comrades behind. Engels and Marx no longer believed it was feasible for the proletariat to join hands with the petty bourgeoisie to achieve gradual social and political change, the two-stage revolution. Now they believed the proletariat must go its own way, striving to defeat the remnants of the feudal order and the current capitalist order to achieve socialism and communism. They raised the slogan of permanent revolution, meaning the revolution could not stop at the bourgeois democratic stage but must be pushed all the way to the dictatorship of the proletariat. But, beyond political struggle, the reality of survival weighed on them like a mountain. After moving to England in the late 1840s, neither Marx nor Engels had much money. The Marx family lived in 2 cramped rooms in Soho, a London slum. Children died because there was no money for doctors, and creditors knocked on the door daily. Marx's great brain would stop thinking if it wasn't fed. This situation forced a reluctant Engels to make a decision that would likely pain him for the rest of his life: return to work at the family business in Manchester. This coincidentally aligns with the Buddhist saying, "If I do not enter hell, who will?" In 1850, Engels returned to the Raymond Engels textile mill he had once cursed. He called it his Egyptian bondage. Imagine the psychological drop: yesterday a revolutionary general commanding thousands, today sitting on a high stool, staring at ledgers, haggling over every pound of cotton, and enduring the flattery of vulgar merchants. Manchester in the early 1850s had changed drastically compared to the city Engels experienced years earlier. It was no longer the hungry city ready to explode in revolution at any moment. The repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846, aimed at lowering grain prices, represented a victory of liberalism over aristocratic conservatism and Chartism. Although there was some unrest in Britain in 1848, it was insignificant compared to what happened on the continent. The British economy was entering a period of unprecedented prosperity. These developments made Engels lament that Britain now had a bourgeois aristocracy and a bourgeois proletariat. He observed that the British working class seemed to have gotten a slice of the pie from Britain's monopoly in the world market, which made them docile. In the 1850s, thanks to the spread of steamships since the late 1830s, new markets in the Americas, Australia, and China opened up, and the British cotton textile industry experienced a boom. Raymond Engels' cotton sewing thread was in high demand. One of Engels' tasks was to audit the company accounts to ensure his father's business partners weren't running side businesses to damage his interests. To his father's surprise, this once rebellious son revealed astonishing business talent. Engels conducted a thorough investigation of the company's finances and found management loopholes. A reconciliation of sorts was reached between father and son in 1851. Old Engels even wondered if his son had finally gone straight. Engels subsequently received a 7.5% share of the company's profits. That doesn't sound like much, but in today's money, it was equivalent to a 6-figure annual salary. He became a genuinely rich man. Although Engels struggled with the disturbing reality that he was making money by exploiting the proletariat, he comforted himself that he was supporting the revolutionary cause by funding Marx, often sending half his annual salary to Karl in London. This was a blood transfusion that lasted 20 years. Without Engels' bank drafts, the Marx family would have starved, and Capital would never have been written. Engels lived a schizophrenic life in Manchester. By day, he was the respected businessman, attending luncheons at the Manchester Exchange, drinking the finest sherry. At night, he returned home to write to Marx, discussing ancient Roman history, military strategy, and Slavic languages. Marx and Engels believed a prerequisite for socialist revolution was an economic collapse, which would create a mass of unemployed workers ready to lead the revolution. From his manager position, Engels could perceive the health of the global market. He became Marx's economic weatherman. But with every economic downturn, the British working class failed to wake up. When the American Civil War severely damaged the British cotton industry in the early 1860s, Marx and Engels had high hopes. This was known as the Cotton Famine. It led to a reduction in raw cotton from Virginia and the Carolinas, affecting British factory textile processing. Thousands of workers lost their jobs, and many factories stopped work. However, frustratingly, British textile workers stoically endured the economic downturn. While the Civil War raged across the Atlantic between 1861 and 1865, cities like Manchester saw no major riots. Instead, these starving workers actually supported the Norse anti-slavery cause, which left Engels both moved and disappointed. Moved by the workers' spirit of internationalism, disappointed by their lack of revolutionary action. With the Revolutionary Front silent, Engels encouraged Marx to continue his massive analysis of capitalism, which would eventually become his magnum opus, Capital. Marx and Engels corresponded almost daily, with the former asking the latter to provide empirical data from Manchester factories to support his theoretical arguments. Those precise examples you see in Capital about machine depreciation, turnover rates, and surplus value calculations, many were copied by Engels directly from the ledgers on his desk for Marx. You could say the ledgers of the Erman Engels factory became the lab data for Capital. The greatest sacrifice Engels made for Marx may not have been about money or revolutionary theory, but about Marx's personal life. This is perhaps the most chivalrous, yet poignant chapter of Engels' life. During these years, Engels unofficially acknowledged Henry Frederick Dermoot as his son. The truth was this: in 1851, while Marx's wife Jenny was visiting family in Germany, Marx had an affair with their loyal housekeeper, Helen Dermoot, resulting in the birth of a boy. This child was potentially Marx's biggest moral stain. If exposed, Marx's already shaky family would have collapsed completely, Jenny might have left him, and his reputation in the exile community would have been ruined. At this critical juncture, Engels stepped up. He silently took on the title of the child's father. Not only did he offer no defense, but like a true gentleman, he kept this secret for 40 years. Marx's family was puzzled by Engels' cold attitude toward little Frederick. Because although Engels paid for his upkeep, he never kept the child with him, which didn't fit his usual warm and generous character. It wasn't until decades after Engels' own death that some of them began to suspect Dermoot was actually Karl's son. Although this remains a controversial issue, and many biographers of Marx and Engels haven't unanimously agreed that Dermoot was actually Marx's son, the sentence Engels wrote on a slate on his deathbed basically confirmed this huge sacrifice made to preserve his friend's reputation. What is clear is that Engels also lived a double life in Manchester, not just for the revolution, but for his own happiness. As a factory manager, he tried to conceal his relationship with his long-term partner Mary Burns, as they never married, an unusual arrangement in 19th-century Europe. While keeping a formal residence to maintain appearances, Engels spent most of his time at the home where Mary lived. That was a small house in the Manchester suburbs, free of tedious etiquette, filled with Mary's lively Irish relatives and friends. There, Engels was his true self. Starting in the late 1850s, to fit his business identity, Engels even became a member of the prestigious Cheshire Hunt. Picture this: the author of the Communist Manifesto, dressed in a bright red hunting coat, riding a tall horse, chasing foxes alongside some of the country's most prominent aristocrats. He bragged to Marx in letters about his horsemanship, even viewing it as military training. Engels was also a leading representative of the German immigrant community and a member of several exclusive private clubs. He treated this socializing as camouflage, and also as a window to observe the ruling class. The pressure of the double life, combined with Marx's constant demands for money and articles, led to him contracting glandular fever in 1857. You can imagine the state of physical and mental exhaustion, dealing with cunning business partners by day, and Marx's bottomless wallet and brain by night. After his father's death in 1860, the Erman brothers tried to squeeze him out of the company, further worsening his health. Nevertheless, Engels found time to contribute to the revolutionary cause by further developing the theory of historical materialism first proposed in the German ideology. For Marx and Engels, history was determined not by great men, but by socio-economic forces beyond their control. In Marx's words, men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. In 1850, Engels wrote The Peasant War in Germany, analyzing the peasant uprisings in southern Germany inspired by the Reformation in the mid-1520s. This wasn't just a history book. That radical uprising was ultimately defeated. Engels drew an analogy between the experience of German peasants during the Reformation and the way 1848 revolutionaries were betrayed by the bourgeoisie. He was looking for reflections of the present in history. Then in the late 1850s, with tensions rising between France, Austria, and Prussia over the prospect of Italian unification, Engels anonymously published Poe and Rhine. In this pamphlet, he not only demonstrated amazing geopolitical insight but detailed the military defenses of the Alps. His analysis of Prussia's position was so incisive that it was highly praised on the continent, to the point where people thought it was written by a Prussian general. This was another source of his nickname, the General. These years were not smooth sailing, they were filled with personal tragedy. In 1863, Engels' personal life suffered a major blow. His partner, Mary Burns, the woman who led him into the world of the working class, died unexpectedly in her 40s. This was a devastating blow to Engels. He felt that the only person in the world who fully understood and embraced his divided soul was gone. He wrote a letter to Marx, his words trembling, "My misfortune is something you can imagine." However, when Marx replied to this news, he wrote only one or two perfunctory sentences of comfort, then immediately launched into a long complaint about his own poverty, his children's school fees, and the butcher's bill, asking for money again. Engels was shocked. For the first time, he saw the chilling self-centeredness in Marx's character. He wrote back a cold letter a few days later, the only true crisis of rupture in their decades-long friendship. But after Marx sent an apology letter, their friendship was sustained. Because Engels knew Marx didn't love him any less, but was driven mad by poverty. He chose to forgive him again. In the days after Mary's death, Engels grew closer to her sister, Lizzie. Lizzie was illiterate but had the same passion and loyalty as her sister. After being together for many years, they eventually married in 1878. Due to his relationship with the Burns sisters, Engels developed a greater interest in Ireland during these years and planned to write a history of the island, exploring its status as Britain's first colony and its revolutionary movements over the centuries. However, this project never materialized because a more important task, capital, was waiting for him. In Victorian London, there is the British Museum, shrouded in fog. In that magnificent round reading room, a bearded man sat like a statue in row G7 year-round. He had rubbed a pit into the floor beneath his feet from long-term friction, and his body was covered in painful carbuncles, sometimes hurting so much he had to write standing up. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in Manchester, another man in a respectable suit sat in his office at the exchange, haggling with cotton merchants while calculating formulas for surplus value in his head. This is the real scene of capital's birth. It wasn't a book written in an ivory tower, it was a book boiled out of the lives, health, and friendship of two men. In 1867, after 17 years of purgatorial work, Marx finally completed the manuscript for Volume I of Capital. This wasn't an ordinary economic work, it was a death sentence for the capitalist system. Marx rewrote and edited significant parts based on Engels' feedback. In fact, without the empirical data on factory acts, machine depreciation, and payrolls provided by Engels in Manchester, Marx's theory would have been like a kite with a broken string. This work, which became massive when all 3 volumes were later completed, rather than the Communist Manifesto, is Marx's most important work. It outlined Marx's entire philosophical and political system and his view on the historical materialist development of humanity. One of the key ideas in Capital is Marx's theory of surplus value. Marx dissected the secret of capitalist enrichment with almost surgical coldness. Every hour of production beyond what the worker needed to sustain himself was appropriated by the factory owner as profit. In more graphic terms, Marx argued passionately about the manufacturer. They mutilate the laborer into a fragment of a man, degrade him to the level of an appendage of a machine, destroy every remnant of charm in his work and turn it into a hated toil. Of course, ironically, without the financial support Engels provided over the years, Marx could not have completed Capital, and most of these funds ultimately came from his shares and work at the Hermann Engels factory. Engels used money squeezed from the system of exploitation to cast the weapon to destroy that system. This moral entanglement accompanied him all his life, but he never flinched. Following the publication of Capital in September 1867, Engels was more than just a reader, he became the PR manager. He knew the book was too difficult to understand and was being intentionally ignored by bourgeois academia. So, he started promoting the book through his contacts in Europe and America. He even anonymously wrote multiple book reviews, some praising, some deliberately attacking, just to spark debate. He said, "In the face of this conspiracy of silence, even abuse is better than being ignored." Finally, the moment of liberation arrived. In 1869, Engels' contract with Hermann Engels expired. It was the end of a long sentence. Neither Engels nor Gottfried Hermann was keen on continuing the partnership. Eager to be done with it all, Engels, through one last piece of shrewd negotiation, accepted a severance payment of £12,000. This was a huge sum at the time, enough to sustain him and Marx for years. That morning, when Engels walked out of the office for the last time, according to Marx's daughter Eleanor who was visiting him, he whistled like a child and even turned a somersault on the grass. He said to Lizzie, "Today, I am a free man." Nevertheless, the often contradictory nature of Engels' activities continued. In the 1870s, he invested most of his severance pay in the stock market to increase his wealth. He was an extremely successful investor. This is perhaps history's greatest dark humor. The mentor of the world proletariat was a stock market wizard. At 49, he felt he had regained his freedom. In the summer of 1870, he and Lizzie moved to London, eager to re-enter the world of revolutionary politics. Engels was immediately elected as a member of the International Workingmen's Association, also known as the First International. This was a communist and radical socialist organization founded in 1864. Engels didn't become a leader who just gave orders as many expected. He was elected corresponding secretary for most European revolutionary parties. Why corresponding secretary? Because of his gift for languages. He could fluently read and write in over 24 languages, even including some obscure dialects. This allowed him to oversee the translation of his and Marx's works into multiple European languages and directly guide the activities of every branch from Spain to Russia. Engels' home at 122 Regent's Park Road soon became the war room of the international communist movement. It was only a 10-minute walk from Marx's home. Every afternoon at 1 o'clock, Engels would punctually appear in Marx's study. The two old men, amidst clouds of smoke, would pace back and forth among piles of books, exchanging their latest ideas. During this period, Marx continued writing the other volumes of Capital, while Engels pursued his own writing projects. He was no longer a passive assistant, he was an equal intellectual partner. Engels' arrival in London coincided with major events on the continent. The Iron Chancellor of Prussia, Otto von Bismarck, set about unifying Germany by force. In 1864, the Prussian army led a German coalition to seize the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein from Denmark. In 1866, Prussia defeated Austria, consolidating its leadership in Germany. Feeling threatened by Prussian militarism, French Emperor Napoleon III, provoked by Bismarck over the Spanish royal succession dispute, declared war on Prussia in 1870. This was the famous Franco-Prussian War. Thanks to Marx's connections, Engels was able to serve as a correspondent for the Pall Mall Gazette during the ensuing short Franco-Prussian War. He finally had the chance to display his buried military talent. Through the cousin of a friend serving in the German army, Engels obtained details of Prussian troop movements. In his articles, he analyzed the war situation like a true chief of staff. A week before the Battle of Sedan on September 2, 1870, he accurately predicted that Napoleon III would be encircled and defeated there. When the prediction came true, all of London was shocked. Marx's letter to him was full of admiration, and from then on, the nickname the General was no longer a joke between friends, but a recognition of his military prowess. Although Marx and Engels sympathized with the Prussian cause, because they believed German unification was good for working-class organization, and welcomed the fall of the Bonaparte regime, Bismarck's demands to annex the eastern French provinces of Alsace and Lorraine prolonged the war, leading to the brutal siege of Paris. Right in the midst of this siege, the Paris Commune erupted. In March 1871, enraged Parisian workers took control of the city and declared the establishment of the Paris Commune. This was a short-lived revolutionary government that streaked across the European night sky like lightning. It was brutally suppressed by the French Third Republic in May. That was the massacre known as the Bloody Week, where thousands of workers were shot against the wall of the Communards in Père Lachaise Cemetery. It is generally seen as the first attempt to establish a communist government in Europe. Meanwhile, the Franco-Prussian War led to the establishment of the German Empire under Prussian dominance. Marx and Engels watched the Commune's every move closely from London. Although they couldn't command directly, they gave advice to Commune leaders through secret channels. The defeat of the Commune pained them deeply but also prompted profound reflection. Marx and Engels believed the failure of the Paris Commune was due to a lack of revolutionary organization and discipline. This reflection made Engels even tougher in the subsequent struggle against anarchists. This was a theme he returned to when trying to undermine Mikhail Bakunin. Bakunin was a Russian anarchist, a burly giant with a fiery temper. He believed in absolute individual freedom, viewed Marxism as a recipe for authoritarianism, and called Marx a German Jew whose head is stuffed with this and that system. The struggle was brutal. Although Marx and Engels successfully expelled Bakunin from the First International at the Hague Congress in 1872, the political infighting fatally damaged the organization. Engels played the bad cop here, using his influence within the organization to defeat the Bakunin faction through procedural means. After losing momentum in the years following the 1872 Hague Congress, the First International dissolved in 1876. Despite the dissolution of the First International, Engels continued to maintain contact with the Social Democratic Workers' Party of Germany led by Wilhelm Liebknecht and August Bebel. He became the godfather behind the scenes of the German party. After Bismarck outlawed left-wing party organizations in 1878, support for German socialists surged, winning 12 seats in the Reichstag in the 1881 elections. From his London headquarters, Engels wrote extensively on political developments in the new German Empire. He also closely followed the revolutionary movement in Russia, which split between Georgy Plekhanov's orthodox Marxism and Nikolai Chernyshevsky's populism, the latter viewing the Russian peasant commune as a model for revolutionary socialism. Although Engels briefly supported peasant communes as a means to overthrow the hated Tsarist autocracy, he ultimately viewed them as a conservative and reactionary institution. At the time, few believed communism would eventually take root in a country like Russia, which had limited industrialization and was primarily an agrarian society. This paved the way for the later emergence of Leninism. Besides working to promote ideological unity among global communists, Engels turned his attention to natural science. This was a very avant-garde move at the time. In Manchester, Engels had witnessed major scientific and technological breakthroughs. Both he and Marx admired Darwin's On the Origin of Species, linking evolution and the struggle for survival with the class struggle in human society. Just as he and Marx treated history, Engels attempted to apply Hegelian dialectics to natural science. Between 1872 and 1883, he wrote a series of papers, eventually compiled into Dialectics of Nature, published in 1927 with a recommendation from Einstein. In his essay The Part Played by Labor in the Transition from Ape to Man, Engels theorized that the development of the opposable thumb led to the ability to make tools, enabling humans to master nature. The need for labor led to the formation of human society and mutual support systems, which in turn generated human language and supported the development of the human brain. This view was not only philosophical but scientifically precocious. According to Engels, labor represented the fundamental condition of human existence and distinguished humans from animals. While this theory on human brain development was subsequently widely accepted by evolutionary biologists, Engels' dialectical materialist scientific framework inadvertently turned science into an ideological battleground for 20th-century communist regimes, leading to the exclusion and persecution of scientists adopting alternative scientific methods, such as the Lysenko affair. This was a tragedy Engels could not have foreseen. In the 1870s and 1880s, to strike back at a professor during who claimed to have invented ultimate truth, Engels also began producing a series of pamphlets. This was the famous Anti-Düring. He extracted chapters from it, adapting them to provide a concise introduction to Marx's ideas for those with no time or inclination to read the ponderous volume I of Capital. The most influential of these was Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, published in French in 1880. The influence of this book cannot be overstated. It sold far better than Capital and became the introductory textbook for Marxism. Engels distinguished Marx's scientific socialism as the natural successor to capitalism, from the utopian socialism of other German thinkers of the time, who were deemed impractical due to their idealism. According to Engels, once capitalism collapsed due to its internal contradictions, the proletariat would seize power and abolish all class distinctions. Under communism, the state would become superfluous and wither away, leading to the ultimate liberation of humanity. Aside from this, starting from the mid-1870s, Engels enjoyed a semi-retired life. Relieved of the responsibilities of company manager and helping run the now-defunct First International, he enjoyed spending time at the seaside with Lizzie and the Marx family. The sea breeze was good for the asthmatic Liz's fragile health, but she was also suffering from bladder cancer. Unlike her late sister Mary, Lizzie retained her Catholic faith and wished to sanctify her relationship with Engels before she died. This was the tenderest moment in Engels' life. On September 11, 1878, hours before Lizzie passed away, Engels summoned a nearby Anglican priest to perform a wedding at her bedside. This materialist, who had opposed the institution of marriage all his life, bowed his proud head to let his loved one go in peace. Liz's death left Engels feeling incredibly lonely, but this was just the beginning of the tragedy. The health of Karl and Jenny Marx was also deteriorating. When Jenny died in November 1881, Karl was too sick to attend to her. Marx lingered on for another year and a bit. Those were heartbreaking days. The once titan of thought could now only wheeze in a chair, exiled to warm Algiers to treat his lung disease, even shaving off his trademark beard. Engels continued to visit his friend every day, trying his best to maintain Marx's final dignity. On the afternoon of March 14, 1883, when Engels arrived at Marx's house, he found Marx sitting in his armchair, as if asleep. But this time, he never woke up. Marx died at the age of 64. Engels wrote to a friend, "The greatest head of our time has ceased to think." Marx was buried next to Jenny in Highgate Cemetery. Only 11 mourners attended that day. If not for Engels, this great man might have disappeared in poverty and obscurity. In his eulogy, Engels declared, "From the Siberian mines to California, millions of revolutionary comrades revere, love, and mourn him." He compared Marx to Darwin, who discovered the law of evolution, establishing Marx's place in intellectual history. But Engels had no time to grieve. He knew that the piles of scribbled manuscripts Marx left behind would turn into waste paper if he didn't organize them. He had to live on, for Marx, and for the future. If you walked into the study of the elderly Engels at Regent's Park Road, you would see a poignant scene. The room was filled with mountains of manuscripts, papers yellowing, edges fraying. A 63-year-old man, wearing thick glasses and holding a magnifying glass, lay sprawled over the desk, struggling to decipher every line. That was the mess Karl Marx left behind, and also the most precious legacy in the history of human thought. Marx was gone, but he didn't take all the puzzles with him. What he left Engels was a silent volcano. From the moment Marx died in 1883, Engels had only one focus in life: to make this volcano erupt. Many people think Engels just did some simple piecing together and organizing. This is the greatest misunderstanding and slight against him. You have to understand, Marx's handwriting in his later years was practically hieroglyphics. Due to chronic illness, anxiety, and rapid thinking, what Marx wrote often had only the first few letters clear, and the rest looked like wild grass blown by the wind. This handwriting was a mix of German, English, and French, and even Russian abbreviations. In this world, only Engels could decipher this code. Worse still, these manuscripts were full of thoughts with no beginnings or ends. Countless to be added blanks, and masses of dry data on Russian agriculture, American finance, and ancient land systems. Because Marx pursued perfection during his life, he was constantly revising, overturning, and rewriting, resulting in volumes 2 and 3 being a pile of chaotic drafts. Engels' eyesight had severely deteriorated by then. He complained in letters, "My eyes are on strike." But like a miner working in a pit, he dug through that mountain of paper every day. He not only had to identify the handwriting but fill in logic gaps, and even finish the math problems Marx hadn't completed. To smelt that gold dust of scattered thoughts into the heavy hammer called capital was an excruciatingly torturous task. He was disappointed to find that Marx had been distracted by collecting vast amounts of data on the American and Russian economies and had failed to develop his arguments. That once magnificent theoretical edifice was missing its roof. In May 1885, after 2 years of purgatorial organization, Volume 2 of Capital was finally published in German. But this wasn't the hardest part. Volume 3 was the real Himalayas. In this volume, Marx attempted to solve the thorniest problem, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and how value transforms into price of production. To straighten out this logic, Engels allowed himself extensive editorial liberty. He reorganized Marx's text, even introducing his own material to bridge broken chapters. You could say that Volume 3 of Capital, which didn't see the light of day until 1894, was less a sole work of Marx and more a co-authored work of the two. It bore more of Engels' imprint. It was his final labor of love to fulfill his old friend's grand dream. Without Engels, Marx's grand economic edifice might have remained just a few boxes of moldy waste paper, sold for scrap. But while organizing his late friend's posthumous works, Engels' brain didn't stop turning. In Marx's pile of documents, he found a notebook on anthropology. It was a detailed summary Marx made in his later years while reading American anthropologist Lewis Morgan's Ancient Society. Morgan's research focused on the Iroquois tribal confederacy, describing the transition from a social organization system of shared property and sexual partners to the monogamous family unit. Engels keenly realized there was a huge secret hidden here. The secret of the origin of the family, private property, and the state. Things we take for granted are not eternal. He was keen to apply historical materialism to Morgan's work and published The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, subtitled In the Light of the Researches of Lewis H. Morgan, in 1884. This book was Engels' most dazzling theoretical contribution in his later years, and it directly pioneered Marxist feminism. In this book, Engels no longer talked about factories and machines, he took the scalpel to what we are most familiar with, the family. He made the earth-shattering point: the monogamous family is not some divine moral product, it is the inevitable result of the emergence of private property. It was to ensure that property could be passed to definite heirs, that is, the man's biological sons. In that famous quote that still deafens today, he wrote, "The overthrow of mother right was the world historical defeat of the female sex. The man is the bourgeois in the family, the wife represents the proletariat." He dug the root of women's oppression right down to the root of private property. This instantly expanded the map of Marxism from the economic field to sociology, anthropology, and gender studies. He told us that as long as private property exists, true gender equality is impossible because marriage essentially becomes a long-term prostitution contract. This wasn't just a theoretical breakthrough, it was a hard slap in the face to hypocritical Victorian morality. Beyond theoretical work, Engels also wanted to see the capitalist future in reality. In August 1888, the 68-year-old Engels visited North America. He had high hopes for the American labor movement, which was organizing a series of strikes in response to the capitalist overreach of the so-called Gilded Age. But instead of delivering speeches to large crowds of striking workers, he preferred to observe incognito. He and his old friends slept on floors, drank ice-cold beer like young men, and traveled from New York to Boston, then back via Canada. Although the glaring electric lights and ubiquitous advertising in New York City made Engels dizzy, he glimpsed the future of capitalism. He marveled in letters, "Americans have a crazy energy, they don't have the baggage of European feudal history." Huge trust monopolies were forming, and the gap between rich and poor was even more shocking than in Europe. He predicted that this young nation would become the hegemon of the capitalist world and also the new battlefield where class struggle would be fiercest. This trip had a revitalizing effect, making him feel like he was back in his youth. Back in Britain, Engels felt the docile British working class had finally awakened. May 4, 1890, was the most glorious day of his life. He joined 200,000 socialists in the first May Day march through the streets of London. That day, Hyde Park turned into a sea of red flags. Engels sat in an open carriage, watching workers of different skin colors and languages singing La Marseillaise and the International. This 70-year-old man had tears in his eyes. He murmured to himself, "If only Marx were here with me today to see this with his own eyes." At that moment, he wasn't just reviewing the parade, he was reviewing the results of what he and Marx had fought for all their lives. Theories that could once only be discussed in Brussels taverns had now turned into a material force shaking the world. However, the socialist revival of the 1890s was led by bourgeois intellectuals like designer William Morris and writer George Bernard Shaw. Neither of them had much interest in or understanding of communist ideas, treating it merely as a fashion. This worried Engels, but he was more worried about erosion from within. By the late 1880s, as he entered the twilight of his life, Engels was more open to the efforts of the Social Democratic Party of Germany, SPD. The party had made significant progress in elections to the German Reichstag, winning millions of votes. This created an illusion within the party: maybe we don't need a revolution? Maybe we can peacefully enter socialism through the ballot box? This sign of revisionism began to appear in his most trusted students, Bernstein and Kautsky. For this, Engels wrote the introduction to the class struggles in France, where he admitted that old-style street fighting might be obsolete. But this did not mean giving up the right to revolution. He warned, "The bourgeoisie fears our legality most, but if they break the law, we will also take up arms." Regrettably, his warnings were taken out of context by later opportunists, packaging him as a moderate reformist. Nonetheless, he remained committed to communist politics and played a key role in the founding of the Second International in 1889. This international organization was no longer a loose club like the First International, it was a massive political alliance. He undertook a European speaking tour in the early 1890s, speaking before enthusiastic audiences. The journey went from Zurich to Vienna, then to Berlin, the capital of the autocratic German Empire and also a stronghold of the Social Democratic Party. When he appeared on the platform at the Berlin Congress, the whole hall stood and applauded. The applause lasted for 10 full minutes and wouldn't die down. Workers shouted "Long live," throwing flowers at this white-haired old man. But he just smiled and waved his hand, saying faintly, "These honors belong to Marx. I was merely fortunate to play second fiddle beside him." But he knew very well that the melody played by his second fiddle had long become its own composition, even louder than Marx in some movements. In his personal life, to show loyalty to the Marx family, Engels supported Edward Aveling. Aveling was the husband, though unofficial, of Marx's youngest and most talented daughter, Eleanor Marx. This man was absolute scum, lecherous, spendthrift, a borrower who never repaid, and he even embezzled party funds. These misdeeds were partially offset, or perhaps masked, by his efforts to organize the British working class in London's East End. Engels' partiality toward Aveling gradually alienated him from the British Labour movement, which gathered around Keir Hardie's reformist Independent Labour Party, the precursor to the modern British Labour Party. This was the biggest blind spot in Engels' later years and the most fragile side of his humanity. He valued sentiment too much. To maintain the already shattered integrity of the Marx family, he was even willing to sacrifice principles to protect the man pushing Eleanor into the abyss. A few years later, shortly after Engels died, a despairing Eleanor committed suicide by poison under Aveling's inducement. If Engels had lived to see this, he would likely have died of a broken heart. Although Engels looked healthy during his European speaking tour, editing Marx's manuscripts and defending Marxism in socialist Congress halls had damaged his health. His eyesight had been deteriorating for years, and by early 1895, he felt a fire in his throat. Doctors told him it was esophageal cancer. For a man who loved food, wine, and loud conversation all his life, not being able to swallow or speak was a torture worse than death. But he showed no fear. In his last few letters to friends, he was actually joking. He said, "My body is on strike, but I am still that happy old man." His condition deteriorated rapidly in late July, and he died late at night on August 5, 1895, a few months shy of his 75th birthday. He died very peacefully, with no religious ceremony, no confession. Having no children of his own, he left more than half his estate to Marx's daughters Laura and Eleanor, while designating the latter as her father's literary executor in his will. This money was the last time he paid a debt for his old friend, and his last attempt to protect those unfortunate girls. But after his death, something even more thought-provoking happened, which is perhaps the most romantic footnote of his life. According to his will, his body was cremated. In the Christian world at the time, this was blasphemy against God, but he didn't care. He didn't want a grave, nor did he want pilgrims. He didn't want to be buried under heavy granite in Highgate Cemetery like Marx, becoming some kind of religious totem. On a stormy autumn day, a few close friends took his urn to Eastbourne in southern England. They climbed the cliff called Beachy Head. It is the highest chalk sea cliff in Britain, with the roaring English Channel below and the European continent opposite. Amidst the howling wind, Eleanor Marx opened the urn with trembling hands. The ashes were scattered into the sea off England's south coast, instantly swept away by the wind, merging into that vast blue. Unlike Marx's famous gravesite at Highgate, Engels has no grave or headstone. Friedrich Engels left a complex legacy. He is one of the most important figures in the history of communism, although he was always overshadowed in the communist movement by his lifelong collaborator Karl Marx. However, Engels was an important figure in his own right. From a very young age, he adopted an antagonistic attitude toward his family's capitalist wealth and walked his own independent path. Although he later reconciled with his father and was happy to live off the proceeds of an industrial firm, even as he criticized the economic system that allowed the firm to flourish. This contradiction, known as being a champagne communist, was precisely his truest side. His collaboration with Marx began in the mid-1840s and lasted half a century, until after Marx's death, when Engels was responsible for editing and completing volumes 2 and 3 of Marx's Capital in the 1880s and 1890s. The pair are widely known for co-authoring the Communist Manifesto, and although it was written primarily by Marx, it was the crystallization of their collective views. However, Engels should not be viewed entirely in the shadow of Marx's work. He was a formidable writer and social critic himself. In particular, The Condition of the Working Class in England, written by Engels in his early 20s, is considered today a classic account of the impact of industrialization on Britain in the mid-19th century. Regardless of how one views Engels' broader political views, it is undeniable that given the crimes of 20th-century communist regimes, Engels and Marx are controversial figures in many respects. Later Soviet dogmatists seized on fragments of Engels' dialectics of nature, turning an open social science into a closed, infallible cosmic truth. There were even absurdities like Lysenko using politics to judge science. This was absolutely not Engels' intention, as he spent his whole life opposing dogma and blind obedience. He warned many times, "Our theory is a theory of development, not a dogma to be learned by heart and repeated mechanically." But at the same time, Engels should not be seen merely as an editor of Marx's works or some kind of sidekick, but as a political writer of weight in his own right. He was the one who lit the lamp in the dark, the one who turned theory into action, the one who pulled philosophy from the clouds back to the ground. How do you view Friedrich Engels? Was he an effective critic of industrial capitalism whose contribution to communist ideology was as influential as Karl Marx? Or does he share responsibility for the cruelty and bloodshed that accompanied communist dictatorships in 20th century Europe and beyond? Perhaps the real answer is like those ashes scattered in the sea at Beachy Head. It has merged into the torrent of history, everywhere, yet nowhere to be found. It reminds us, the world can be changed, but such change requires a price, requires wisdom, and above all, the courage to go forward even if millions oppose you. I'm Raymond Shadow. Thank you for accompanying me on this not-so-short intellectual journey to reacquaint ourselves with this figure who, to a greater or lesser extent, wrote history. Please like and subscribe, and tell us your thoughts in the comments section. Looking forward to seeing you next time.